Hey, it's Checkmate with another how-to tutorial for Die in the Dungeon. In this video, I'll give you the tools you need to defeat every boss in the game. I will reveal their weaknesses and give you some expert tips that will make these guys look easy. I'll link in the description to my Steam guide, which I will keep up to date on any changes or additions to the game. Please be sure to like the video and subscribe for more Die in the Dungeon tutorials. First of all, let's talk about the bosses that can spawn in Area 1, the Buried City. The two first bosses can be either the Croissant Chef or the Scorpion Rider. The Croissant Chef, or the Caterpillar Baker, whichever one you know him by, I think looks like a large caterpillar himself. He has a bow on his back, which make him resemble wings for a butterfly or moth that he never grew into. He spews out the croissant pillars, the various caterpillars and worms that have tasty modifiers, and bakes each of them with a different effect. These can range from beneficial ones like healing the player or providing block or thorns, to dangerous ones that deal damage or poison to the player or add thorns to the enemy. Because the different modifiers of the caterpillars are random, it makes for a very hectic and crazy fight, and the soundtrack for this boss mirrors that. The boss will start by spawning in caterpillars and also taking actions of its own. When the max number of caterpillars are spawned in, the chef is freed up to do more dangerous attacks. Whenever the caterpillars are killed, the chef will spawn in more and will usually do a more of a supportive action, such as adding block or healing. Even after you've killed the chef, you'll still have to defeat all the spawned in caterpillars in order to win the boss fight. So there's really two paths to take, either continuing to destroy the caterpillars so that the chef spends time spawning them back in, or go directly for the chef and leave the weaker enemies for later. In vanilla difficulty, the chef has 75 HP. D2 difficulty makes bosses stronger and will give the chef 99 HP. On vanilla difficulty, the chef's first action is to attack for 9 damage. That's a really high attack for Area 1. The other two actions it has will be to apply 6 block or to heal for 6. When there are fewer than 2 caterpillars, the chef will spawn in more. When the chef spawns in those caterpillars, it usually chooses from one of its more passive actions rather than hitting the large amount of damage. The maximum number of caterpillars that can spawn in are 2. In D2 difficulty, the max number of caterpillars is actually 3. In this difficulty level, the chef will deal 12 damage for its large attack. When it blocks, it will block for 8, and it will heal for 10. On D0 difficulty, the caterpillars that spawn in will have 4 health. However, in D2 difficulty, they can spawn in with 6. The caterpillar family is pretty numerous, and there are a lot of different modifiers that can take effect. There's a lighter blue one that when killed will give block to the player. There is the standard orangish one that when killed will deal damage to a random enemy. There's a reddish one that when killed will deal damage directly to the player. There's also the green one that will heal the player. There is a yellow one that will grant an energizer to the player when killed. There are also ones that apply poison, one that applies poison to the player and one that applies poison to a random enemy. Likewise, there are also darker colored worms that when killed will apply 3 thorns to a random enemy or will apply 3 thorns to the player. At a glance, you can tell apart the helpful versus non-helpful worms based on their eye color. The ones that harm the player will have a red-eyed version of that same color. So when building your deck for this boss, you'll want to look for ways of killing multiple enemies at once. If you're playing as Cinder, she already starts with a D8 splash attack that can do a considerable amount of damage to the chef itself while completely wiping out the other caterpillars. Some other strategies of dealing damage to multiple enemies can be to use flash attack. Listfer has the Winged Sandal relic as a starter, which will add 1 haste spot to the board, which can make any dice act as flash. Keep in mind that in the first action, the chef will do a very large attack, so make sure that you have a way to heal up afterwards or that you can block that first attack on your first turn. You can also go a slightly alternate route and use mirror or terrain or some combination of boosts to deal large amounts of damage directly to the chef himself, making the fight much shorter and less complex with all the different effects and modifiers that are going around. A couple more tips. When the boss gives defense to the other croissant pillars, it's still worthwhile to kill them to make sure that the boss continues to do more passive attacks rather than large damage to you. Try to keep track of all the effects like poison and thorns that are on you and the enemies when the caterpillars are killed. Having a balanced hand with block coming in regularly can help mitigate damage when you have things like poison stacking up on you. Let's talk about the Scorpion and the Scorpion Rider. This boss is returning from Origins. You can actually check out some of my older videos for further tips and information on how to beat him here. Overall, he has less health than in Origins, but the bonus damage spots are only doubled versus tripled like they were in Origins. The Scorpion himself is very imposing, and one thing that you'll notice is even though there are technically 2 enemies, you can't click on the rider and target him. Lore-wise, the Scorpion's been trained to take all the hits. However, there is a spot that generates randomly on the board called Small Opening. When you place attack dice on this spot, the damage is dealt to the rider instead of to the Scorpion. You can't actually kill the rider. When you deal enough damage to him, he is stunned, and the scorpion's stunned along with him. When that happens, there are 2 spots marked on the board with multipliers on them. When you play attack dice on them, the final damage dealt will be doubled. After 2 turns, the scorpion rider and the scorpion will recover from being stunned. In the very next action, the scorpion rider will boost the scorpion, meaning that his subsequent attacks will start dealing more damage. This is a very cool flow to the boss fight, where you deal damage to the rider, stun the scorpion, deal big damage to the scorpion, and then when they recover, they start escalate, making it a really fun fight. On base difficulty, the scorpion has 150 health. In D2, with the stronger boss modifier, the scorpion will have 180 health. In vanilla difficulty, the scorpion rider will have 12 health, versus in the D2 modifier, he has 20. There are a couple different actions that the scorpion can take. It can either do 2 smaller attacks, which in D0 is 2 attacks of 4 damage, and in D2 is 2 attacks of 5 damage, or it can do a single stronger attack, which in D0 is 10 damage, and in D2 is 12 damage. The scorpion rider also takes actions during this turn. In D0, it can either attack for 5 or block for 5, and in D2, it either attacks for 6 or blocks for 6. As I mentioned, once the scorpion rider recovers from being stunned, his action will be to apply a +1 boost to the scorpion, which means all future attacks will each have +1 damage than what they normally do. In general, you benefit from having a very strong attack when going into the scorpion rider, since dealing damage to the rider stuns it, meaning any block dice that you draw on the subsequent turns when the scorpion is stunned are just completely wasted. Make sure that you have enough health or enough block for that initial turn 1 attack, but really focus on dealing damage to the rider and then capitalizing on the boost to deal a lot of damage to the scorpion itself. You should build your deck in a way that you can easily target the small opening wherever it is on the board. That means you're going to want to have boost dice that roll 2s, so that way you can reach any spot on the board, say for Cinder. With Listfer, you're going to probably want to have dice that roll 3 or maybe 4, because then you can reach more areas of his board. Use flash attack dice to target the rider in a small opening multiple times in a turn. Having flash terrain is also super powerful because you can play the flash terrain on the small opening and then immediately take advantage of its boost to try to deal more damage to the rider. Again, the scorpion cannot attack when he's stunned, which means you should really focus on dealing damage at this point. The double damage spots will spawn randomly, but look for opportunities where you can use 2 attack dice rather than 1 for increased damage. Now, that being said, if you choose to play more conservatively or you have a low damage build with heavy block and lots of heal, then just don't stun the scorpion rider at all. Just whittle him down. The boss fight will be slower, but if you stun the scorpion and don't have enough attack to really take advantage of his doubling spots, then the scorpion rider will keep escalating and will be a bit more dangerous to you otherwise. As a final tip, just keep in mind that splash attack does not target the rider. This might be an intentional design choice, or it may be a bug that might be fixed in the future, but just keep this in mind, especially since Cinder starts with that splash attack D8. Next, let's talk about Area 2, the Monarch's Grove. There are 2 different bosses that can spawn here. The Queen Bee and the Mantis Bros, or twins or siblings or whatever you choose to make of them. We'll start with the Queen Bee. Presumably the Monarch's Grove is named after her. She's a very, very large bee that is hinted at by the presence of other worker bees that could appear in earlier battles in Area 2. She's a returning boss from Prologue or Classic or whatever you choose to call that version of the game, and personally this fight is a huge favorite of mine. There are 2 worker bees that appear in the Queen Bee boss fight. They will spawn 2 honey dice on the board that can't be removed from it. Additionally, the very first action the queen will take is to put 3 honey dice in your hand. The honey dice that the queen gives you are glass, so when you use them, they'll be broken and they won't keep clogging up your deck. Now, honey dice in general are a very bad thing. The tiles that the honey dice target are halved in value, and this applies for every honey dice that is targeting that same spot. However, there is a spot on the board that will randomly spawn in as a crown slot. When honey dice target the crown spot, it turns into royal jelly. Royal jelly doubles the value of the dice that are played there, and this applies for every single honey dice that's played on it. So each honey die will double the value of the dice on the royal jelly, which allows for exponential boosts. The Queen Bee has 300 HP on vanilla difficulty, or 375 on D2 difficulty. This is a lot tankier and chunkier than any other enemy encountered so far, including the other bosses. No offense to Her Majesty, of course. The bee workers themselves will have 26 HP on vanilla or 35 HP on D1 or D2 difficulty. The Queen Bee has a couple different actions she can take, aside from giving the player the glass honey dice. She can attack once for 14 damage, which is 16 damage in D2 difficulty, or she can charge up an attack and attack twice for 10 damage, which is twice for 14 damage in D2 difficulty. Keep in mind during this time the bee workers will also have actions. In vanilla difficulty they can attack once for 8 damage or block once for 6 damage, and in D1 and D2 difficulty they can attack once for 10 damage or block for 6 damage. Furthermore, in D2 difficulty, there's only one crown slot that spawns rather than 2 in vanilla difficulty. This boss has the most potential for being broken to the player because of that insane multiplier. Make sure to use the worker bees as well as any honey dice that you get in your hand to target the royal jelly slots. If you have a hollow attack or a D4, it will allow you to use more honey dice to double, quadruple, etc. that royal jelly spot. Now keep in mind that the worker bees are capable of really large amounts of damage too, so try to avoid targeting their honey dice, which will boost them and continue to increase their attack. Try to make sure you have a pretty consistent hand in terms of block. If the Queen Bee does nothing in one turn, her next turn will be the devastating double attack, so make sure that you have a block dice on hand to deal with that. The royal jelly spot is pretty versatile, so even though I'm advocating for boosting a single attack to the moon and basically being able to one-shot anything in the battlefield, you can also use that to boost up a block really big. If you're using up the glass honey die, try to keep different faces in your hand, keeping in mind that the boards are a little different. For example, for Cinder, you can really only target a single spot with 2 honey dice that roll 3s. If you have a mixture, say some that roll 1s or 2s or 3s, you could have potentially more dice that are targeting these spots. Prioritize boosting a single royal jelly spot because every honey dice that you add continues to double the final value, making a larger return than splitting up into 2 dice. The Mantis Bros are a returning boss from the Next Fest demo, so again, you can see some of my older tutorial videos on some further tips and tricks to take them out. This is a dual boss, and you'll have to defeat 2 phases in order to complete the fight. The smaller purple Mantis is called the Sickle, and the taller green Mantis is called the Scythe. In phase 1, both will have monitored spots on the board. When you place a dice on the purple monitored spot, the Sickle will immediately deal 1 damage to you, before your turn ends, before his turn even starts. However, when you place a die on the green monitored spot from the Scythe, it will increase the Scythe's attack by the final value of whatever dice you put on that spot. When you kill one of the Mantises, the other one immediately regenerates into a phase 2 form. So keep in mind how you're building your deck, which will influence which phase 2 you want to face. For the Sickle's phase 2, every spot on the board is covered except for 1 free spot. When you place it on his purple spots, he immediately deals 2 damage to you instead of 1. The Scythe is a little more strategic. He covers all spots except for 1 free one, but half of them are blue and half of them are red. Dice that you place on the red spots will again increase his attack by the final value of whatever dice you put there, and the ones that you place on the blue will increase his defense by the final value that you put in there. Both Mantises start off with 45 health, and on their phase 2 they'll heal up to 75 max HP. However, in D2 difficulty they both have 70 HP, and their phase 2 will heal up to 100. Their only default action is to attack, and this starts at 1 damage but increases each turn, so on turn 2 they will deal 2 damage, and on turn 3 they'll do 3 damage. That's because most of their actions are influenced based on what the player does. So again, make sure that you know what you're building your deck for. But in general, the Sickle Mantis is a lot easier to defeat in phase 2 than the Scythe, which means you'll want to kill the green Scythe first. Now, if you have a deck that focuses on only 1 or 2 dice played, or your deck relies heavily on flash, kill the purple Sickle first so that you can face the Scythe. In terms of tips, the Suppressing Eye Relic is really cool because as long as you target the Sickle, in that first phase you can play dice without worrying about his damage at all because it decreases it to 0. And even in phase 2, it decreases his return attack from 2 to 1. If you rely on flash attack, then definitely go for the Scythe's phase 2. You can play your flash attack dice down and then take them all off the board so that the attack or the damage of the Scythe isn't boosted. You still have 1 free spot that you can play a little bit of defense if you don't want to take damage from him on his actual turn. This boss is probably one of the most difficult for new players, simply because you have to do a lot of the calculation in your head. It's also a little punishing for decks that are a little disorganized and rely on covering the entire board or placing down boosts and dice indiscriminately. However, with a deck that focuses on synergies and some strong and supporting relics, you can be defeating these guys in no time. Finally, we've made our way to Area 3, which is the Dormant Palace. The final boss is the Mosquito Duke. He's a very tall mosquito with a beaked mask. His attacks are imposing, and he carries a long sword. For his soundtrack, there's a shrill discordant noise of strings that really help to bring to mind the whine of the mosquito. And just as a real-world reminder, the mosquito is the most deadly animal in the world. The Duke has 3 different stances that it can cycle through, which is intended to make the player adapt to what the enemy is doing, rather than controlling the flow of the battle like they do for most enemies. There are some very devastating attacks and very large amounts of damage that the mosquito can do, as well as putting defense on himself. However, it's really the Duke's ability to place leaks on the board, which reduce damage of dice placed on them, and to insert sting dice into the player's hand that make this a really formidable enemy. The Mosquito Duke has by far the highest health of any enemy, 500 at vanilla difficulty. This increases to 650 at D2 difficulty. As I mentioned, there are various actions that the Duke can choose from based on the stance that he's doing. For D0 difficulty, it can be an attack of 14 with a block of 8, or it can be an attack of 10 with a block of 18, or it can be a devastating attack of 22 damage. This escalates even higher on D2 difficulty. He can do an attack of 20 with a block of 14, or he can do an attack of 14 with a block of 24, or his powerful attack is 32 damage. There are 3 different stances that the mosquito can take. Make sure to hover over his modifier as it can change from turn to turn. The first stance, which is accompanied by the big attack, is if the Duke is attacked, he will insert a sting dice into the player's deck. These dice are glass and retain, so they will stay in the player's hand and continue to clog it up, but you can get rid of it by playing it. However, it deals its damage to the player and gives heal to the mosquito, kind of like a lifesteal mechanic. On his second stance, he will place leaks on the board wherever the player has placed dice. These leaks will then subsequently lower the value of dice that are played on them, but that is the only way to get them off the board. Finally, the third stance will destroy a die if there are 2 or more remaining in the player's deck. By this time, you will have had the entire run to build up a deck that's good enough to take him down. You'll have to be able to block the massive damage that's coming in, or heal back up, and you'll have to deal big enough damage to chip away at his massive health pool. If your deck is set up or defense heavy, take your time to avoid the sting dice getting inserted into his hand by not attacking him when he's in that stance. However, be aware that there are relics that auto-attack, like Shuriken or Poison Cloud, which will still trigger this effect. Just don't play your sting dice. That damages you and heals the boss. Instead, wait for the Duke to have his third stance and then use that opportunity for him to destroy the dice without you using it. Keep this in mind as you build your deck. You should have things like draw dice or double dip that can help compensate for otherwise bloat in your hand. As a final tip, you can rearrange the dice in your hand before finishing your turn. Make sure that the sting dice are on the left-hand side of your hand, so it's the one that the Duke will destroy when he has that stance. Just in general, mirror and terrain are readily available in most runs, and they can really help you maximize your attack or be versatile enough to boost healing or defense depending on what you need. But at the end of the day, this boss is meant to be challenging. It's the final boss of the game. I hope this strategy guide is helpful in your journeys in the dungeon. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button, and hey, check out some of my other videos for more guides or speedruns or just some good gameplay.